Our scripture reading for today is found in Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 to 32. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds come and perch in its branches. This is the word of the Lord.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Good to see you all here. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors, and we've actually been in this message series called Emotionally Healthy Mission. Can I hear you say Emotionally Healthy Mission? Now, I realize that some of you who are new to our community are probably wondering, what does that even mean? What are we talking about when we talk about emotionally healthy mission? Well, we've been talking week in and week out about a lot of times these two values of health and mission are often posed against one another, as if one cannot be healthy and still be missional and growing. In other words, being results-oriented is what we're all about, or being healthy is what we're all about. But rarely do the two come together. And yet what we've been exploring is how Jesus actually invites us to fulfill the Great Commission by fulfilling the Great Commandment, which is loving God and loving others. Another way that we've talked about emotional healthy mission is these three words. We've talked about going slow, deep, and wide. High five your neighbor and say, slow, deep, and wide. That's right. Some of you are like, I'm still confused. I have no idea what we're talking about. Yeah, and it's this idea that hopefully we are a people who hopefully have slowed down our lives to be able to hear from God. But in the same way, we're actually doing a deep kind of work with Jesus so that it's not so activity driven, but it actually wrestles and confronts the deepest parts of who we are. And we go wide. We still care deeply about missional engagement, about caring for the needs of the marginalized, about reaching out to our friends, neighbors, roommates, and the rest of New York City. Now, emotionally healthy mission, what we've talked about is how we often talk about how there's progress and joy or mission and morale. These two words are often used, again, pitted against each other. But throughout the scriptures, we've talked about how the Apostle Paul uses these words of progress and joy. That mission is important, but also joy, the way that we do mission is important. Or mission and morale. That again, it's great to be reaching and expanding, but it's also equally great and just as important to hopefully develop a culture in which morale, the way that we love one another, the way that we do community and relationships, mirrors the ways of God. Now, today we're talking about this theme of mustard seed multiplication. Now, what's been so stunning about Jesus, and if you know anything about the Christian movement, it didn't start with just this massive crowd that gathered, heard Jesus, that received tons of miracles, and all of a sudden it blew up into this big movement. It actually started with a small group of folks from this no-name town called from Nazareth. And so from this small, no-name kind of country town called Nazareth, Jesus, and this is what we explored last week. We explored last week how Jesus started with these 12 disciples, and somehow it's grown into a movement that today we stand or sit in this room, and we're exploring the ways of Jesus from a Korean American guy who grew up in Los Angeles, talking to Shay, who grew up in Florida, and here we are, and all because of this movement that started so small and seemingly insignificant. Now, Jesus would actually talk about it, because look at the passage that was just read. Jesus would often talk in these different parables, and parables are basically these illustrative kind of ways of trying to communicate spiritual truth. And he does so with a very significant object lesson. Look at what he writes, he says, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds come and perch in its branches. Now, he's speaking to an agricultural society that is aware of this mustard seed. Now, to give you a sense of a mustard seeds are generally 1 to 2 millimeters in size. Now, check out this picture. You can kind of get a sense of the scale of this. Now, I recognize some of you all might be like, well, there's some smaller seeds than that. Well, you see, Jesus is actually, again, in that known time, he's giving an illustration of what would have been common for people to understand. And he uses this illustration. He says, the kingdom of heaven, the work that he is doing or beginning, it actually starts with this small millimeter little seed. And you can almost just see this microscopic, it's not microscopic, but this zoomed in view of this mustard seed. So small, so insignificant. And yet what he actually illustrates is that mustard seeds can actually grow into plants or trees that grow up to 20 to 30 feet high. Here's a picture of what a mustard seed tree can actually grow into. So when Jesus is actually talking about a tree that grows, and he actually uses this image, he says this mustard seed actually can grow into this magnificent tree where the birds can find its shade. Could you imagine? Like, he uses this illustration to talk about what the kingdom of heaven might be like. Now, in today's world, what we're looking for is the viral moment, that get big quick moment. In fact, in today's culture, this is what we applaud, don't we? We applaud something that can grow quickly, and the younger the founder is, or the younger this movement is, the stronger and more powerful it grows viral. That is what is of value. And yet Jesus talks about something way different. He has a different subversive way about talking about growth and mission. He says, you know what it's like? It's starting with this small moment or this small way of faithfulness, much like a little mustard seed. And then it grows into this magnificent tree where birds can find shade and covering. You know, as I was thinking about this whole kind of theme of mustard seed multiplication, I was actually thinking of our own story of Hope Church. If you've ever been around or come to Intro to Hope, you've probably heard the story of Hope Church NYC. It actually started in Astoria, Queens. And that church, the original church that it started with, started in 2012. And I thought actually that I would show you this picture. That's from 2012, everyone. You're like, who is that guy who has hair? That was me 12 years ago. This was actually one of the first pictures from 2012 when we were starting the church. We had no ambitions or thoughts about starting a church in Manhattan, mostly because our movement really started with us wanting to serve the needs of the marginalized. And in Astoria, this neighborhood in Western Queens, it has some of the largest housing developments in the city and in the nation. And so we really wanted to start a church that would serve the needs of the marginalized. Now, of course, from that moment, of course, the church has grown. We have started multiple churches across the city. But I look back at that picture, and I blush a little bit, and I'm a little bit stunned. And as I was reviewing kind of these pictures, in fact, here's another picture of one of the first days, and you can see some folks here. Ed Podlovitz there, who's on the left, Rob Walderman, and Jose, who's there in the middle. And that church, the original church that we started, actually still exists, and it's still in Astoria. It's humming. It's doing really well. A pastor by the name of Christian Hernandez and Denise Rosora Cry, they're the ones who's leading that congregation, and that's the same venue that we met in, and that's from 2012. And I look back at that picture, and I'm kind of like, I was so desperate. I mean, I'm wearing a suit, guys. I mean, I like kind of insecure and like wanting to kind of feel respected and feel like I had it all together. And there's a part of me that looks at this picture and I'm just kind of like, wow, it's stunning to believe that here I am standing in the Upper West Side, and kind of it started in Astoria, Queens, and yet that was one of the origin stories. And I look back at all my insecurities and the ways in which I've been longing and hoping that God would do something, and yet trusting and believing and thinking, I don't know if God will do anything. It's a little stunning. A guy by the name of Gary Walter, he actually has this phrase where when he talks about kind of the ways that God works, he says, you will often overestimate what you can do in the short run. Because I remember we started with a group of like 15 to 20 people, like just starting gathering, and me dressed in a suit and tie. And just thinking, oh my goodness, I hope after like a few months we could just maybe have 20 people, like that was the dream. And here's what Walter says, he says, we can often overestimate what you can do in the short run, but we vastly underestimate what God can do through a lifetime of faithfulness. In many ways, this quote actually illustrates what mustard seed multiplication looks like. That somehow it's the faithfulness, the simple, small faithfulness that actually makes a significant difference. Now, I actually don't show that picture of me. The reason why I wanted to show that picture of me 12 years ago is because I realized, like even these last 12 years, I realized all the ups and downs and moments of my own feelings of disillusionment and pain the sorrow that I felt when I've made poor decisions or I have not been the best version of myself as a pastor or as a leader, when I've needed incredible grace for myself for the ways that I would be neglectful towards my wife or towards my children, the ways in which I was overeager to prove to everyone, like, look at what we're doing as a church. And I look back and I realize, oh my goodness, like God's been so tremendously faithful despite some of my own misgivings and mishaps. And for a moment, I just took a step back to this past week as I was thinking about this passage just to reflect on like what God has done and the ways that he's been faithful despite the ways that I have not. Here's a picture of a young man named June. June is actually someone who, at the Hub, which is our ministry center on 31st Street and Park Avenue, June, this summer we actually had coffee together, and he was a college student at NYU who had just graduated. And he came into the Hub, and he walked into that room, which is the second floor chapel that we have at the Hub, and he was just like, oh my goodness, flashback to like 3 years ago. And I was like, what happened 3 years ago? And see, he had not been part of a church community, not really been involved in any kind of religious activity. But actually through this college ministry that we partner with called Soon, he actually was met for the first time with a group of other college students in that room. There was a group of like 50 of them all masked up at the Hub. And he told me this story. He said, this is actually where I met God for the first time. And it's kind of stunning to be here. And I was so surprised because I'm like, this is the place where you met God? And he's like, yeah, this is the place where my life changed forever. And I was so stunned because I remember during the pandemic, if you recall, like during the pandemic, so many people left the city. And we actually purchased the Hub in 2019. We did a full renovation of the Hub. And the renovations we were supposed to be finished with them and open the Hub in April of 2020. Great timing. But something happened in the world. And if you recall, like during the time when everyone was fleeing the city, all sorts of articles came out about how New York City is dead. Everyone's gonna leave the city. And during that time, I was thinking, God, why'd you have us buy a building? Like seriously, of all the things to invest in, it's the one thing that people are saying, no one wants to live in close proximity anymore. They're all moving to the Poconos. I was like, why did we not buy a building in the Poconos? And then I looked back and he told me this story and I was just kind of moved. The reason why we were meeting for coffee was because in 3 years during his time at NYU and being part of our church community, he ended up getting baptized. And this fall actually, he was sent off to become a missionary in Japan. And I just thought, oh God, what a mustard seed. Thanks for just having us say yes and for having people say yes. Here's another picture that I thought I'd show. It's a picture, some of you may or may not know this couple, and it's Howard and Ophelia, and they actually just got married in April. And they met at Hope, which was so exciting, and you could see I'm there with a lot less hair. And along with my wife, Tina, and we took a picture at their wedding together. And one of the things that I love about their story is because we remember when both of them actually started coming to Hope. And so Howard was someone who grew up in Long Island, went to university in Michigan, ended up moving to New York City, stumbled into our church, and through that got involved in kids ministry. And I remember talking to him, and of course, the two topics that are most prevalent for young adults in our world today, it's work and love. And of course, we're talking about both those topics with him, and he's just so eager. He's like, I want to date, but I want to, I don't know how I'm going to meet somebody. And we're like, hey, this church is a great place to meet people. And then I remember meeting Ophelia. She had just graduated. She actually grew up in China. And she actually went to graduate school in New Haven, Connecticut, and she ended up coming to New York City. And she was checking out the church with this other person one time. And she just so happened to check out Hope Midtown. And at Hope Midtown after the service, we're just chatting, and I'm like, hey, we're actually having this women's clothing swap that's happening down at the Hub. Do you just want to go down there with me? And she's like, who are you? Like, why are you inviting me to a women's clothing swap? I'm like, believe me, my wife is the one hosting it. She ends up coming to this women's clothing swap that I know that Hope Westside actually, Jinsu and team, I don't know if you're here, Jinsu, but like, I know that you all hosted one a couple weeks ago, or a few weeks ago. And so Ophelia actually hopped on the bus with me and her friend, and we all went down to this women's clothing swap. And Ophelia ended up telling me, she goes, if you had not invited me to that women's clothing swap, honestly, like, I don't know if I would have stayed, because the service was She didn't say that, but that was what I gathered, you know? She said, actually, it made the biggest difference for her just to come to this woman's clothing swap. She got to meet other women there. And then somehow, because she stayed, because of this women's clothing swap, she met Howard. And Howard actually, the way they met was because Howard actually, this other person that was in Howard's small group said, hey, have you met this girl, Ophelia? I think you'd really hit it off with her. He's like, I haven't met her. How can I contact her? You know, and so through that, they actually met, and here they were, and they got married. And I just thought, like, gosh, of all the misgivings, of all the ways that hope we haven't gotten it right, I was just like, at least this one couple found love. At least there's a story of how a mustard seed somehow brought this couple together. At least there's one story of God's faithfulness. And, these are just a couple of stories. I was just writing down and journaling this past week about like ways in which God has been faithful. And I'm just like, wow, God, I thank you that from a guy who was so insecure and needed to feel like I belonged by wearing a suit in front of everyone, like somehow, God, there's all these stories of people and relationships and friendships and ways that people have met God and met people and grown in community and grown in their love for you. Thank you for your faithfulness. You know what's amazing, though, is that 12 years, right? It's been 12 years since we started Hope, and I was thinking about mustard seeds and how God uses these mustard seeds to grow. Recently, my brother and I, who lives down in D.C., we took our sons, we took them to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., one of the museums which actually houses the Constitution. If you've ever been there before, you know, Jin's nodding her head, and so is Idris, you know that there's a rotunda, and in that rotunda, and here's a picture of it, in the rotunda, there's actually this beautiful, grand hall that essentially the Constitution of the United States, as well as the Bill of Rights, the original copy, is right there. And so people parade along and they look at the Constitution as well as the Bill of Rights. And my brother and I, as we're showing this to our boys, and our boys are 12, they're both like, what's the big deal? And we're like, oh, do you understand? Like this country, the founding documents right here. This is amazing. And they're like, okay, can I get your phone? And I'm like, well, and so we're trying to explain to them, we're like, do you realize the monumental, like this place, it houses the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And it's been 235 years since the constitutional U.S. has started when it was ratified in 1789. It's been 235 years. And then a part of it, like both of us, my twin brother and I, we both kind of stopped and we were just like, oh my, that's not that long. 235 years ago? And here we are, we're talking about like this historic site, like this is amazing, 235 years. And it got me thinking about history and the ways of thinking about like mustard seeds. Like 12 years feels like an eternity to me, and yet 235 years, that feels so small. And I actually started thinking about the early church, which started about 2,000 years ago. Like just thinking about it, Jesus actually gives this teaching about the mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It's just a small, insignificant thing, but man, when it grows, it surprises us in the most profound kinds of ways. And it grows beyond our wildest imagination. And so I actually dug up some statistics about this early Christian movement. Because if you can imagine, right, Jesus, who's this no-name carpenter, who's actually teaching this small band of disciples, who last week we discovered was this ragtag group of unschooled, ordinary people, and a larger group of men and women who followed after Jesus, is so significant considering Rome and Caesar Augustus, who had all the power in the world, all the military strength, all the social capital, all the financial capital, all the weapons. And Jesus, he's starting with this small group of insignificant people. And look at the statistics. In 40 AD, which is roughly around the time that Jesus resurrects from the grave, a historical event that we Christians believe really happened. 40 AD, look, the estimated Christian population at this point, because people had heard rumors of this Messiah who was teaching with great authority, but who was healing the sick, and who was talking about a new ethic of loving one's neighbors and forgiving those who persecute you. Now, Jesus, who comes with this revolutionary message, but actually embodying a way of peacemaking that is so different than the ways of the world. The ways of the world are all about weapons and fighting and who's stronger. And Jesus comes with this ethic of love and sacrifice. And look at what happens in the face of incredible persecution and bloodshed. In the year 40 AD, it's estimated there's 1,000 Christians. And historians, non-Christian historians, talk about how these Christians were this ragtag bunch, and yet somehow, look at what happens. In just a few years, and by 100 AD, that number had grown to 7,000 to 10,000. Even though Rome, with all of its power, was trying to snuff out this movement. Now, that was 60 years. Well, check this out. From 40 to 200, so 160 years later, that number actually grows to 200,000. Now, in the midst of continued persecution of the Christian movement, it's not cool or hip to be Christian. In fact, it could cost you your life. And yet, somehow, there's something about what the Spirit does, about what God does to enliven the hearts of these Christians, that this movement would actually not get snuffed out, but it would actually grow. It would grow into 200,000. Now, here's a crazy thing. When it gets to 300 AD, so 260 years later, now imagine this, okay? 260 years of continued persecution. Think about the history of the constitutional United States. Over that same period of time, the Christians are just this minority that's been persecuted, put to death, their family's been put to death, and yet somehow this Christian movement, over the length that's longer than the history of the constitutional US, this movement actually continues to grow without any power or social capital. Isn't this amazing? It grows to 5 to 6 million by 300 AD. Now, this is stunning because, again, years before that, 260 years before that, Jesus had given this teaching. He says, you see, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's like a mustard seed. It starts so significant. And yet somehow, it grows into this enormous tree that brings shades and beauty to the world. See, but it's not only these 260 years till 300 AD. I mean, just think about it. We stand in this room, or we sit here from various different backgrounds talking about this same mustard seed. Now, this is extraordinary because if you know anything about the writings of the early church, it wasn't this group who had social capital. They were the most influential people on social media or in finance or had enormous riches that were actually changing the world in this early church. No, it was actually a diverse group of people from various different classes. Now, one of the places that I find so stunning about this mustard seed, because in these early days of the church, check out this picture. This is a picture of the Mamertine prison in Rome. Historians actually believe that the Apostle Paul, as well as Peter and others who had been imprisoned for their faith, actually probably wrote their letters from prisons like these. Could you imagine? This is in Rome, and these are some ruins of a prison. Could you imagine Paul, who's preaching about this resurrected Jesus, but he's stuck in prison, and he's writing to these early Christians, and he's basically like, hey, Remember that teaching about faith being a mustard seed? Things seem pretty impossible right now. Now, those aren't specific words that Paul wrote about, but again, the teachings of Jesus and the way that Paul would write about, for to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. He writes from a prison cell, believing against all odds. Can you imagine just sitting in this cell, being like, oh my goodness, I'm about to be put to death? Put to death. But Jesus taught about this mustard seed. Something seemingly insignificant that grows into something so unbelievable. And that's what the kingdom of heaven is like. Somehow that Paul and others would somehow have this vision to believe that we today are in this room, and it's because of this belief and the reality and this prediction of this mustard seed that would grow. There's this passage from the book of Hebrews, which I love. Check it out, because in the book of Hebrews, it talks about this, the monuments of faith, the way that faith has driven the early church in the midst of some of the hardest circumstances. And look at what it says. It says, they were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. Now, the book of Hebrews was written, historians estimate, between 64 to 69 AD. So the author is writing about these people who believed in faith, that their small moments of faithfulness would actually outlive them. And look at what the writer writes. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. The Apostle Paul ended up dying for his faith. No, he couldn't even celebrate the reality of like, oh my goodness, look at Hope Westside. They've got coffee from Krispy Kreme. I had no idea we were getting coffee. Thanks, whoever did that, Taylor or Jeff, whoever. No idea. And yet, isn't it stunning? Look at what the author writes. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. There was such an outstanding kind of faith, this mustard seed kind of faith, this living in the moment kind of faith, this belief that even when I die, my small kind of moments and choices of faithfulness will outlive me forever. If you think about it, it would be hundreds of years later before Christendom would spread all over the world. And yet the earliest Christians held on to this mustard seed of faith. Now, what does this mean for us? Here's one thing as I was reflecting this past, what does it mean for us? Relax. In fact, high five your neighbor and say, relax. That's right. Relax. I mean, just imagine like, God's doing something so invisible and crazy. I mean, I look back and I'm like, oh my goodness, God, you've been faithful through the history of Hope Church. And Hope might die one day, but I know the kingdom of God and what God is doing in the world will, like, God's alive. And if God is alive, like what? Like, I am just a small, insignificant part of this whole thing. And if I am, then I could just relax. God's doing something that will outlive me and you and all of us because God is God and we are not. I can relax, we can relax. Let's all relax. But here's another thing. What does mustard seed faith look like, right? It's the small, insignificant things that we believe that somehow God does something enormous out of something so small. What does that mean? You know, in Alcoholics Anonymous, which I talk about regularly, in the 12-step movement, you know, when people relapse or when we might fall into addiction and we're apt to keep stumbling back, right? When it's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And even if you haven't been to a 12-step meeting, you've probably known that experience of how hard change and transformation can be. How difficult it can be, especially when life is difficult and hard. I remember going through my own season of depression when I was unemployed. My wife was pregnant, feeling such a loss of identity and trying to figure out what was up, what was down. Felt like my whole faith was being threatened in many ways. And I kept coming back to this phrase that Alcoholics Anonymous uses often for those who are struggling with addiction. It's a phrase about just kind of the simple faithfulness of each day. It's a phrase, one day at a time. One day at a time. You might not be able to beat your habit or beat your addiction right now in one fell swoop. Forever and ever, amen. Your depression might not change just overnight. The difficult circumstance you find yourself in at work or at home or as a parent may not change overnight. But if you can just focus on today. You know what's so stunning is in the Old Testament, there's the gift of manna that's given from heaven, from God. The Israelites are wandering in the desert and they're wondering, where's food going to come from? And one of the things that God does is God says, I will provide you with manna from heaven, bread from heaven. But here's the thing about this manna from heaven. You only get it each day. You know, when I read that passage, I'm like, come on, God, each day? First of all, it's just bread. Can you give some filet mignon or something else, you know? Or at least give them enough bread for at least like 6 months or maybe a year. That way they know, okay, God is really for us. But there's something about the most stressful time that the Israelites find themselves in, that God actually provides manna for just a day. It's almost this reminder like, will you remain dependent? Will you just, with whatever you're going through in life, when it comes to work, when it comes to love, when it comes to whatever season you might find, could you just make the decision to be faithful each day, one day at a time, believing and trusting that God is doing a work. There's this beautiful book I read. You know, so many people ask questions about what is the will of God in my life, and we think we need this answer, right? Like, I need to change the world. I need to do something so much more impactful than finance. No, I'm just kidding. Finance people, love you all. I hope you know, if that's what you're in. Regina, nice, I love it. I mean, we think we need to have these grandiose visions, but there's actually this beautiful book written by Jerry Sitzer, who's a professor at Whitworth University and a spiritual writer. And one of the things in this book he wrote, it's called The Will of God as a Way of Life. And one of the things he talks about is there's his revealed will, and there's his permissive will, and there's his hidden will. So many times we want to get to know the hidden will. Like, I want to know, like 20 years from now, where am I going to be? Or I want to write my own vision statements. And here's what he basically says. Do you realize that the will of God is simply being faithful to each day? There are so many things in God's revealed will that he's given to us about being a people who can remain rooted in his love, remain humble in our disposition, remain hungry for more of God, remain hungry for more of God to be known in the world. And here's what we can do. Whatever industry you find yourself in, whatever kind of longings for the will of God, what if each of us could just, as a way of life, just one day at a time, God, I realize I want to figure out all the mysteries of the future. And what if the invitation for me and for you when it comes to mustard seed multiplication is just be faithful with the little that God has given to us. We've been talking about the great commandment. Here's the little that God has given to us. Here's the invitation. The invitation is to love God and to love others. That's the invitation. What if each day our aim and our invitation and our heart was, God, help me to love you more. I realize that I've loved my career. I've loved my ambition. I've loved the New York Mets, Jimmy. Sorry, Jimmy. I've loved all these other people and things more than you. God, help me to love you more. Help me to love you. I realize I've loved kind of what I do when I get anxious or afraid. I run to my addiction of church because I love that more than I love you. And God, today I just want to make a choice, just one day at a time. Just this first day, I just want to submit and say, God, I want to love you more. And I want to love others well. I want to be the kind of presence that wherever I show up in the world, in work, at home, with my family, that I can love others well. Now, if you're anything like me, I look at this and I'm just basically like, oh yeah, it looks so simple, right? But I look at this and I'm like, oh God. I realize there's so many times I fail to love you the most. So many times I fail to love other people the most. Oh God, please help me. One of the reasons why we gather each Sunday is not so that somehow we can do our religious duty, but somehow that each one of us would have an encounter with God. So many of us that we could come together and just have our minds that have been so seasoned with the ways of the city and what it tells us about what success looks like when it comes to relationships or work, and to somehow be reframed and jarred again to come back and be like, oh, mustard seed multiplication, one day at a time. Just reorient. God, would you today, this moment, would you reorient my heart, my wandering heart? Would you reorient it to you? Would you reorient my relationships? Would you give me the capacity to ask for forgiveness, to reach out to someone who maybe I've hurt or who has hurt me? Would you grant me the courage to just, in my heart, the courage to become a more loving person? It doesn't have to come in one fell swoop. Just one day at a time. Because that's what mustard seed multiplication is. See Apostle Paul writing from a prison. Writing from a prison. To live is Christ. To die is gain. whether I'm in chains, whether I die, or whether I live, the gospel goes forth. For that I rejoice. And who knows what God will use with your and my simple act of faithfulness